Hello and welcome to the Truth C Squared podcast. My name is Shmez. Joined as always, good friend, co-host Colin Carlson. We kind of have a off the top podcast that we wanted to do that has to do with a post I made about our last podcast and kind of some of the topics we talked about there. And we had some good responses and some good discussion that we wanted to share and address in this video. So I first just need to read what I posted, and hopefully it makes a little bit of sense. Maybe I can get it on the screen. I don't really care to get on the screen that much, but here, I'll cover you up. There we go. That works. Oh, there we go. Make it a little bigger. Okay, so I'll just read it, even though you guys can see it. Sorry for the long post, but I find this concept absolutely fascinating. Hopefully be posting another video about this on our YouTube page, which I still haven't posted yet, that has to deal with this conversation about the nature of decision-making under compatibilism. A lot of it's based off of Michael Prochetto's book. And here's a summary of it. You're responsive to reasons. That means you're conscious, coherent, able to perceive and process information. One or more of those reasons are sufficient for you to make a decision. Those reasons are grounded in your understanding of reality based on your experiences, knowledge, and disposition. This view still denies alternative possibilities, but upholds moral responsibility and therefore freedom, just not in a libertarian sense. It was an interesting thought experiment to apply this framework to Eve's decision to eat the fruit and disobey God. Her sufficient reason for eating the fruit were explained in Genesis 3:6. It was good for food, attractive to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. And it did fit in her understanding of reality. She had no reason to distrust the snake. She'd never been lied to, never been exposed to the concept. She really didn't even understand the concept of death. No experience with that either. Her knowledge about God's commandment was incorrect. She misquoted the commandment, saying not even to touch the fruit. And her disposition was to be like God. She wanted the knowledge. This is also hinted at when she birthed Cain, saying, I created a man just like the Lord did. So obviously her disposition wasn't to trust and obey God. At least that reason was outweighed by all of the other reasons. It wasn't sufficient enough to keep her from sinning. So if you add up all the reasons, the lying snake, God not being present, fruit was good for food, and etc., and consider them against what Eve knew and experienced and her disposition, to a compatibilist that can only equal one outcome, Eve sinning.
I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
Minor. I would argue God was present. I think you're just being careful and probably didn't really care to be very specific there. But
why do you think you would say God's present? Obviously, he's omniscient. Obviously that, but
he's
not
omnipresent, right?
yes.
So he's going to be there.
Yeah, that is true. And actually, when I explained this to a friend today, he mentioned that, and I was like, I meant it more in a way. To Adam and Eve, they were not aware of his presence, nor seeking it.
Right, and so that's why it's just minor. I don't really care.
That's fair. That's very fair.
Then the other thing is her disposition to a compatibilist. This could only equal one outcome.
I think it could only equal one outcome.
Yes.
To me, that's a point of debate, sure.
But and Finny tries to poke holes in it, and we're gonna see that in a bit. It has to do with the reactivity piece in John Martin Fisher and Mark Revisa's theory of responsibility. But I wouldn't necessarily word it like that. But again, I don't. It's minor. So
yeah. Okay. That's. I'll take that one. Okay. Now, what were the reasons? What were the reasons those reasons what?
What were the reasons that existed in the first place?
In the first place is where determinists struggle. Like, why did Eve have the disposition not to trust God but trust the snake? Why was her desire to be like God, which led her to disobeying him? Transworld deprivation may help understand that. Why was the snake there? That's the $1 million question, and unfortunately, this is one of those things the Bible doesn't explicitly explain. It just assumes it in the story. Not everything can be neat and tidy explanations. And the more I've thought about that, the more that is true in my own head. Honestly, the whole concept of Satan is not even justified or explained that well in the Bible. It's just like he was there. He's the father of lies. He's the, like, the guy who sins and blah blah blah. All these things we know about Satan, the Bible just says it is. It doesn't explain how we get there. And not even
Right.
those Old Testament prophecies, I don't even think are about Satan. I don't think either of them are. One for sure isn't. The other is very loosely tied to Satan. But anyways, that's besides the point. Why was God not with them? God was searching for them, and they were hiding themselves. Obviously, God knew what was going on and knew where they were, but didn't do anything to stop or guide them away from the snake. And
Mhm.
God gave them no warning about that snake that was not to be trusted. God placed the tree there to begin with. All this to say, God did, knowing full well that it would lead to sin with no question. Not that he was tempting them to sin, but naturally, God knows exactly what's going to happen. And given those circumstances, he knew what was going to happen. Like, I feel redundant saying that. Why didn't Adam stop her? Again, consider moderate reasons responsiveness framework. He had no reason to distrust Eve. After all, God gave her to him to be a helper. He trusted and followed what God made more than God himself. Sounds par for the course for humans. And even when God directly asks him, why did you take of the fruit? He literally says, your woman that you made me and gave me as a helper gave it to me. That was his reason. So it's very explicit in the text why. So overall, God did determine this outcome by allowing the different temptations and then removing himself from the situation so Adam and Eve would truly be on their own, free to make their own decision, and they chose to sin.
Uh, Whenever I use the word allow as a determinist, we have to be very careful. Like, without like we have to preempt it with a lot of different like nuances, or else you're gonna get like the layman and compatibilist indeterminists saying, but you can't have allowing underneath determinism. So
Well, I don't
God
care.
directly determined. I know, but and we've already talked about this on the podcast.
Exactly.
I've defended it many, many times. But just for the listeners who are new,
Yeah.
um, by allowing, we don't mean bare permission,
Yeah.
like allowing in a libertarian free will sort of sense. What we mean is a refraining of grace. So he
Yes.
allows certain temptations to come about because he refrains his light from the situation,
Exactly.
and evil is a privation of light or an absence of light. So evil
Mm-hmm.
will naturally come through the light if he refrains his presence in a specific space dimension,
Yes.
namely our dimension. So
Yeah.
he can take his grace out, and then evil temptations. Temptation is a type of evil, I think, uh, can inflict his creatures, and obviously it did so with Adam and Eve.
I mean, look at Job. Cert. Perfect.
Right.
And you know what's crazy about Job is God was the one that was like, yo, Satan, check out Job.
Yeah, dude, I don't understand how this is totally side note, but I don't understand how any open theist can get around Job. I
Dude,
don't care.
it's so explicit.
It is completely they wanted so much preserve God's goodness, but yet you see God making a cosmic bet with the devil. Literally.
And winning.
It doesn't make any sense to me. The only escape that I can see that they could probably do is if they make it complete allegory,
Which
like
I'm not opposed
allegorical.
to even admitting that it probably is allegory. Um, but even so, if it's real life too, it fits perfectly well. That's the most ancient story in the Bible. Actually, there's one other. The Song of Deborah is more old, but that's it. Like Job is the first like written down story we have from the Bible, which is insane to me. But anyways, let's finish this part up.
Yeah.
So God caused the sin only in the sense that he created Adam and Eve, not perfect. He created the environment and then he removed himself from the situation deficiently caused. So Adam and Eve were free to decide for themselves. I think any theist would agree on those 3 points. God created them, not perfect. God created the environment and God was not present. I don't think you can argue this wasn't the case, but you can disagree and say that those reasons weren't enough to be considered determined. But I believe this
I think
framework can be
it's very
applied anywhere to explain why people do certain things and why the decision-making process can be compatible well with compatibilism. So overall, like I kind of wrote that just in a, flippantly, like I didn't really well think it out. I was kind of, how I am. I figure things out as I talk. But I think it did a relatively good job of explaining where I was coming from, and how you can take the framework of moderate reasons responsiveness, apply it to biblical characters, and not maybe give a perfect explanation, but at least it makes a little bit more sense why they're doing what they're doing. Like it helps you understand where they're coming from and how God relates to them. I think, for me personally, it's helpful for that. The first thing I wanted to mention, there's Finny Raju. I'm not sure how to say your last name. I'm sorry, Finny. So I'll just call you Finny. Has really good responses that this whole video I told him to make a video about. But before we get to him, I wanted to make some comments on what this guy Alexander said. So I'm just gonna read some of it, and the reason I'm reading it is because I could not agree more with this dude. I'm so happy he said what he said. He said, well, in the creation story, we're reminded that the world was very good. We're told to be stewards, to upkeep and subdue the world. And this speaks to general, normal degradation of worldly things. I agree with that. We see in the story of Adam and Eve as an extremely practical, everyday example of our choice between being with God or degrading into the worldly. Again, he's speaking like a pastor right now. Love it. Now, speaking of worldly, I get the idea of pigeonholing God into just between free will and determinism. These ideologies are all just worldly abstractions. At some point, the debate is adiaphora, which is like, I don't know exactly what it means. Colin, can you look it up and read the definition real
You
quick?
just said it. It's just there's no straight answer. It's basically just
It's up for debate.
yeah. So he says at some point the debate is just a diaphora, which is just it's mute. It's like a
Yeah,
blank slate. Like you're
exactly.
just going to be arguing about things just to argue about things, but there's really not going to be a straight answer. I mean,
Yeah,
and he's not wrong. Philosophy is often that.
yeah,
Now, obviously, I will argue that there's still value in it, and I don't
yeah.
think he's not saying that there's no value.
Yeah.
But
So
that's what
he
he's
goes
saying.
on to say, my question would be, what exactly is the everyday practicality of being able to categorize God? Is this an insecurity thing, or if I know God does X or Y, then I'll finally be able to walk with God? Why such little faith? We cannot exact the will of God by subduing him into our worldly knowledge, science, abstractions, aesthetics, and logic. It's no better than atheism. Instead, we must present ourselves to God through the Spirit. That is the church. Only then can we move with the will of God. And I'm like, pump that directly into my veins. That's exactly the character and attitude I want to have with this stuff.
I
That
mean,
I cannot agree with this dude more. He's asking an honest question, I think. He's like, what's the point of this? At some point, there's no straight answer. And anything you do say is going to be pigeonholing God in one way or another.
I
And
disagree with that. I
I
don't know why it would be pigeonholing God if we claim determinism to be true.
if we claim determinism to be true beyond a shadow of a doubt, while like claiming and criticizing and ostracizing anyone else who doesn't agree with us, that would
Uh,
be. So we're determinists who are willing and okay with being wrong about being determinists. Like other people can be
yeah,
Christians and very smart and, well known in the church and great theologians and all the titles and accolades you can want and not be determinist. And I know both me and you are okay with that. Some people aren't. Okay, so I said I love this take. I agree with almost all of it. Overall, I'm definitely a pragmatist over any other theological camp. I only really care about what's useful. But what I don't find useful is those who demonize and pigeonhole the compatibilists into a view, the compatibilist worldview into heresy. So I'm working to show that it could be true and it doesn't make God evil. So if many people disagree with that, I wouldn't be talking about it so much. Ideally, wherever you fall on the spectrum of freedom or determinism, we should be a unified front against atheism. That's my main goal. Stop coming after compatibilism and go after atheism. I find that to be a worthy goal and useful overall. I made this post on the page. I've made posts on this page about personally, to me, it doesn't matter too much if God operates, whether it's Arminius, Molinist, Calvinist. I don't care too much. And I hold this debate with an open hand. Either way, it doesn't change my view of God, but almost all of the time, Calvinism would destroy the concept of God for those who don't agree, and it shouldn't. Personally, I find it really helpful and useful in my own life to think of God as a deterministic worldview. It gives me a peace of mind, leads me to want to learn more and worship God even more so than before when I was an Arminianist. To me, it's a more robust view of God, easier for me to understand, makes more sense than a view I was told growing up. Overall, I know I'm wrong in some way, and I'm okay with that. I'm trying to seek the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that I may know him better. I know I'm an idiot, but this stuff is a great practice in the process of learning and understanding God better, which is useful overall to me. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it fascinates and motivates me to learn more about God. That is extremely true also for me. I'm just going to go on. So he responds, yeah, I think it's careful. I think we should be careful throwing around the concept of heresy. I think truths are often obfuscated. I don't know what that word is.
It
OBFU.
just means like uh, jumbled up, like meant to cause confusion.
Okay, so are often confusing behind biases, which runs the spectrum from naturalistic determinism to metaphysical libertarian. They're both useful tools, but I think calling one or the other folly or heresy is not recognizing the utility of both. We shouldn't be enamored by one human conceived tool over another. And I said, yeah, I'm reiterating what others have said to me, calling me a worshiper of a deity of deception because I'm a determinist. To me, that's unhinged and unhelpful. Stratton, you hit the nail on the head. That is unhinged. I should say I do like how you put the argument forward. I also don't believe seeking God should ever be considered heresy. There's nothing wrong with being more aware about these conceptualized components of God. Furthermore, when we start to idolize these conceptual components about God, well, that's between a believer and God at that point. I have faith that the entity of the church, the Christ church, can withstand a little confusion sometimes. And I said I couldn't have said that better myself. So just to comment on that, like that he pretty much got to the heart of like where I'm getting at. I wouldn't be making these videos, I wouldn't be posting on the group, and I wouldn't be talking and thinking about these things constantly if we didn't have detractors calling Calvinists devil worshippers, deity of deception worshippers, and just second rate Christians at this rate. And they're saying the quiet part out loud with how they interact with us online. And I know this to be true because I was one of those people before. I felt like that towards Calvinism before. And at this point, it's just becoming more and more obvious to me that it's unhinged and unhelpful. Like I said, like it really pisses me off to the extent that I want to defend it against my own brothers in faith when honestly we should, like I always say, and what I hope we make a point of this podcast, we should be a unified front against Arminius. Like, agree to disagree, have each other's back, recognize the utility of the ideas on both sides. Some is helpful to others, some is not so helpful. And depending on who you're talking to, it's like, how do you want to approach the situation? Like, how do you want to explain God to them? What would make sense to them or be helpful to them? Not that you need to lie about your own views, but knowing everything and the utility of it all is very helpful. But you're not even allowed the courtesy of the other side admitting that your side has some truth to it and it makes a bit of sense and maybe covers some bases that your view doesn't. So we don't get that courtesy, which is why we've been working on this so hard. But
Yeah, and I
yeah,
don't know why it's just Calvinism and determinism in general. I mean, there's been a lot of good work, good philosophical work behind theological determinism and Calvinism lately, and just in the last 10 years. And people defending it philosophically, theologically, analytically, pragmatically. I mean, seriously, like it just baffles my mind that a lot of non-Calvinists think that Calvinism is going to die out in like within the century or something. And that may be true, but I don't see why, especially when they claim the author of evil charge. Like some people on our debating theology group
all the
claim
time.
it like vehemently, and I'm just like, I get really turned off by that. To me, it's literally akin Actually, I'm just going to use his name because you know what? Who cares? But Guillaume Blanchett on here, my last interaction with him, I literally wasn't even gonna. I don't know if you saw it, but I wasn't gonna even like talk too much about him, or talk too much to him, and I just said like, I don't know why you're pressing the author of evil charge here, and he's like, because your God is an author of evil underneath Calvinist determinism, and I'm like, you see, don't you get upset when people press the grounding objection against Molinism because he's a Molinist?
Yeah.
And they absolutely, if you don't know what the grounding objection is, then look it up. Maybe we'll have a podcast episode on it later. I don't know, but I don't even like pressing it because the literature is like knee deep in the woods. You think Frankfurt style examples are like hardcore knee deep in the woods? Talk about the grounding objection. Holy junk! Like it's just so much literature on it, and it's basically at a stalemate now. People aren't even really talking about it that I know of. Why? Because Molinists don't like they think it's a ridiculous objection.
Yeah.
And I find the author of evil charge against Calvinist determinism just as equally ridiculous. Like people have already answered this.
Yeah.
You're either convinced or you're not. If you're not, okay, well then don't go out saying I'm like telling people that, oh, the
It's
author
so
of evil, like
obvious and
this,
clear,
that's
and
so obvious that you should
yeah.
like why would you be a Calvinist? What? Like it's the exact same. It's akin to or analogous to me saying, why are you a Molinist?" It's so obvious that he doesn't have any grounding for believing counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, libertarian freedom. But the Molinist is just going to look at that. Side note: Jonathan Thompson, a really good friend of Shemez and I, he's an entrenched Molinist. He's really, really good friends with William Lane Craig, like the William Lane Craig. He goes to his church and everything. He straight up told me, yeah, he doesn't find the grounding objection remotely convincing, like at all, like not even close. And I'm like, I find the same thing with the author of Evil Charge, and he's like, that's why he literally said that's why he does not press it against his Calvinist friends because he knows like, oh well, if I don't like them pressing against the grounding objection to me, why would I press the
Yeah.
author of evil charge? Because there's answers, even
Yeah.
though he's a Molinist, I'm a Calvinist, we're not going to press each other. That's all I was saying to Guillaume, and he was going to town, just going back and forth, trying to press this
Yeah.
argument. What's the point? I don't think any of that matters. like,
No.
uh, it doesn't matter, and I just don't understand. I mean, yeah, we're bashing at times Molinism and incompatibilism and um, different models of providence and different theological views, but all with a good conscience, I think,
Yeah.
because we
It's
would
a lot
deny
of
those views if given other evidence.
the like reasons I hold what I hold about Molinism is because partly I misunderstand what it's all about, which is why I've made some posts to get some clarification about some things, which has been helpful. And also because I just haven't been like confronted with good arguments for it necessarily. Not to mention that I don't find it biblically, nor is in my own personal life has the concept even crossed my mind before. So I'm not. It's like a completely different language to me. When all of this stuff, when Colton described it to me the first time about Calvinism, I could recognize it in my own life and recognize it in Scripture like that. So I don't know what's that worth, but one thing that like I think really boils down this whole conversation, the first part is like, furthermore, even when we start to idolize conceptual components of God, like it's a problem. Or
Right.
we shouldn't be enamored by one human conceived tool over another. Like,
I think
if
it's problem when you call someone else's view a deity of deception
that
or heresy. When
it's been my gripe since the very start with that dude. You cannot say
when
stuff like that. It's
it
inflammatory.
It is technically orthodox, you know what I mean? So, like, Calvinism, you can complain to Calvinism all you want, but they believe in the Trinity. They
Yes.
hold to the Nicene Creed. They hold to the Apostles' Creed. They hold to the Chalcedonian Creed. They have proper Christology. Obviously, not all non-Calvinists would agree that Calvinists have proper Christology, but they have a robust view of theology proper. They have ecclesiology has very, very little to do with Calvinism. The only
Mm-hmm.
thing that's potentially wonky or heretical about it is a providential model, specifically with regards to grace and soteriology, right?
Yeah.
But then, even then, we are taking a straight Calvinists take a strict view when it comes to Ephesians 2:8, that for by grace we are saved through faith, not of our own works, but it is a gift of God. We take a strict view of that,
Yep.
and I don't see anything condemning it in the Bible. And
Faith isn't
so
a work, dummy.
the
Didn't you know
the the
that?
issue the issue is that when these non-Calvinists, and just Christians in general, gripe about a different view, I contend that they ought to be extremely careful. Because
Yeah.
what happens if we die and we find out that the view that you griped, that you called God a deity of deception with, that he would be a murderous, ungentlemanlike
Genocidal,
pig, genocidal
child
maniac, if
murdering.
Calvinism was true? And you're saying that as a Christian, if you die and Calvinism is true,
Wah, 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 wah.
I think honestly you just committed some blasphemy there. Like straight up. Like you committed blasphemy.
It's
So you ought to
definitely,
be extremely very
yeah.
careful when you critique another view and say, under your view, God is like blank. Very hard to not commit blasphemy there.
Bro, if if
Mm.
if Catholic faith is true, I'm screwed. I'm just handout, dude. I'm so screwed. I hate Catholicism so much. Oh my word. One dude in our
No, I
group,
understand Catholicism.
Musafa, he tried to bring up like stuff from the Apocrypha to like make an argument. I'm like, he like posted an Apocrypha verse. I'm like, I don't see that in the Bible. I'm like, where is that even coming from? He's like, it's in my Bible. I'm like, cool. Is it a Catholic Bible? He's like, yeah. I'm like, I don't care. I don't care at all. He's like, how do you know my
For
Bible
the
is not the
record,
true
we are
Bible?
Protestants,
I'm
and
like, because
we're
it's if the Catholics agree with it, then I disagree with it. Like, come on, dude. I don't. To me, Catholics are like one of the biggest like knocks in the Christian faith. Like they
their
set us
philosophy though
back.
is solid. I think the Catholic philosophy on classical theology is like straight, really, like really,
My
really
my
good.
biggest gripe is what is it called? The
Bibliology.
no, it's sacraments.
Oh
Hate
yeah.
that. Hate that, dude. Oh, you have to do this, this, and this, and this, and give us money, and blah blah blah. All these
They do
different
not say
steps.
that. That was the Middle Ages. They do not say give us money. Like, are you serious?
You'd be
Dude.
surprised. No, that was the Middle Age, but I'm arguing against the historical Catholicism too. But it's like adding extra steps to what otherwise is simple salvation is very off-putting to me. And they, as a Baptist, they murdered us in droves back in the day, so that doesn't help. All right, so let's. Are
Be
you
a
good to move
Baptist.
on?
I'm gonna move on.
Okay. We're over here getting unhinged again, so let's. So the main point
Whatever.
that was Finny's stuff, like I mentioned, and Finny, I'll make a timestamp for you. We're at about 30 minutes in or something. I don't know. But he says, I like Fisher's reasons responsiveness theory. I think, however, though, too many problems emerge when you try to use it to bolster the Calvinist view of determinism. But before I
That's
get
exciting.
into that, what? What'd you
No,
say?
I'm just saying that's exciting. But and by the way, I have talked with Finny, and he's going to mention this later in the thread. But I have talked to Finny like years ago, like a year after Preciado's book came out. I read it, and Finny read it,
Mm-hmm.
and he said something specifically, like on the thread, like to some years ago in 2020, I think, and he said like, well, ref, ref, Reformed Calvinism is incompatible with contemporary compatibilism, namely guidance control. And I'm like, really? Because you just see, I finished a book arguing for the compatibility.
Yeah.
And so it's Preciado's book, and we got into it. I think it was like a week or two long, like week or 2 week long discussion
Mm-hmm.
thread. It was literally just me and him on the discussion. We were going to town, like three comments, three, four comments each.
Yeah.
So we've talked about it before. I'm gonna bring in some of those
Okay.
things that we talked about, but just that gives us a background of where he's coming from, where I'm coming from.
All that to say, Finney's a really smart dude. We both
Right.
respect
Yeah.
the crap out of him. And there's really good stuff that he brings up. So let's talk about it. He said, before I get into that, your description of Eve seems to actually imply that her decision was morally justified. In her own mind, it was morally justified. That was kind of the point. But like, does that make it actually morally justified? No. Since her reason to act outweighed reasons not to act, giving her limited knowledge at that point. That's fair. To avoid this conclusion, Fisher would state that Eve was also able to have reacted to other reasons pointing toward a different direction. For Eve to be responsible, the mechanism by which she made her decisions, her cognitive faculties must be reactive to other reasons. She must have been able to choose otherwise had she been confronted with sufficient other reasons. Christopher Evan Franklin makes a strong case that reason's responsiveness does in fact depend on some compatibilist conception of alternative possibilities.
Okay,
I
so
call
stop here.
Cap. Oh.
So, first of all, the main beef of that paragraph is he's just explaining reason's reactivity. So, moderate
Mm-hmm.
reason's responsiveness has um, three real components, and that is strongly receptive to reasons. So, what I call the existence of reasons exists. Reasons need to exist for
Yeah.
you to do otherwise, right? Whether or not you act on them is the reactivity part. He is centralizing that part, the reactivity part, and then the third condition, as we explained in previous episodes, is just the understandable disposition, understandable pattern, the sane pattern of Eve reacting to that reason. Like it's not out of character
Yeah.
per se. Now, we claim that that out of character or out of disposition is consistent through deprivation.
Yeah.
And what he's saying, and we're going to get to that in a bit, but what he's saying is Chris Evan Franklin makes a strong case that reason's responsiveness does, in fact, depend on compatibilist conception of alternative possibilities. No, it doesn't. Here's why. Because Chris Evan Franklin posted that article in 2015. Taylor Sear in 2017 replied, and I have it right here.
Uh-oh. Oh no, he brought receipts.
And he first says, and Finney made the same mistake here, that Taylor Sear says there's a difference, and Franklin doesn't appear to understand the difference. So Taylor Sear makes sure he understands the difference in the article. And by the way, the article is in 2017, free on Academia. So Taylor Sear has an Academia website. You can just type him in, and he has like 29 articles. This is one of them. And the article says semi-compatibilism, which is John Martin Fisher's view, Preciado's view, no ability to do otherwise. And the difference here is the first distinction is there's a difference between alternative possibilities and no ability to do otherwise. So
Yes.
alternative possibilities and ability to do otherwise, those are different. And he's saying that Franklin doesn't appear to understand the difference. So what's the difference? Alternative possibilities just has to do with the receptivity part, the existence of alternatives. We don't live in a fatalistic universe. Okay, so even if the world is determined, there are still possible worlds that could have been determined differently, right?
Yeah.
All things considered, even if we scrap out God had to create this world in a deterministic like fashion because he is all good and he has to create the best of all possible worlds. We can table that discussion for now. Generally, we don't live in a fatal determinists aren't going to say Calvinists aren't going to say we live in a fatalistic universe. So there are alternatives, different ways that God could have determined. Okay. So alternative possibilities still exist, but the ability to do otherwise, that's the contentious part. And that's the thing that instead of Finney using the word alternative possibilities, he should have used compatibilist conception of ability to do otherwise. So he's playing really loose right here with his words. And Taylor Sear says the exact same thing to Franklin, who Finney cites. So we need to break those apart. So what's the issue? Does Fisher's theory of reason's responsiveness entail alternative possibilities or the ability to do otherwise? In the first part, I think it's clear it entails alternative possibilities, right?
Yeah.
But that's not what Franklin was arguing. Franklin was arguing that all compatibilists, Franklin's actual articles, everyone believes that the ability to do otherwise is necessary for responsibility. That's literally the title of the article, or something like that. Now, he used the ability to do otherwise, not alternatives. And so Fisher's theory does hold that alternatives are necessary. The receptivity part calls for it. The reaction part technically calls for it. You need to have alternatives. But Sear responds to Franklin and says, but wait, does Fisher's theory entail the ability to do otherwise? And Sear says no. But here's a caveat, and I don't like how I'm just going to say I don't like how Sear argues it because I think Sear is playing too loose. He keeps saying, "Well, underneath Fisher's view." In 2018, so a year after Sear published this article, Fisher actually concedes to Franklin, like straight up. Like he says, "You're right, Franklin. My semi-compatibilist view does require a dispositional ability to do otherwise. The same disposition we are interested in for agents to be morally responsible." So, and actually, it's in Preciado's book. Like Preciado quotes that same quote two times, one in the appendix and one in one of the chapters. He quotes that same quote from Fisher, conceding to Franklin, from Fisher's 2018 article, conceding to Franklin's 2015 article. Okay, obviously, Sear didn't have access to that article when he wrote this paper, right?
Yeah.
But still, Sear says, okay, Fisher's theory needs alternative possibilities, does not need the ability to do otherwise. But wait, how can we construe, because apparently Fisher knows his theory best, right? Fisher's theory does seem to entail an ability to do otherwise, specifically with the reaction component, but it's only with one small piece. And it's literally the piece called reactivity is all of a piece. I'm putting that in quotations here. What does that mean? It means it literally comes from Fisher and Revisa's original theory in 1998, where they claim weak reactivity is all of a piece, or it's the sameness. So I have another way to put it is mechanism individuation. So like, how can I be the same, or at least that's how I understand it. But how one mechanism can be the same for every single person. You understand so far?
Yeah.
So Sear says, okay, their theory, if they hold to that piece, that idea of reactivity is all of a piece part, Sear says, yes, then that does mean their view entails an ability to do otherwise, namely a dispositional ability to do otherwise. But, Sear says, that part can actually be taken out of their theory. So what does Sear do in that 2017 article? He actually shows how he can take that piece out, still have the basic components of guidance, control, moderate reasons, responsiveness, still have an agent being responsible with no dispositional ability to do otherwise. And so he says then, under Fisher's view, alternatives may be necessary, but the ability to do otherwise definitely is not, which is sufficient to show Franklin to be wrong, that not everyone believes an ability to do otherwise is indeed necessary. To me, it seems like a sort of cop out because you have to modify the original theory in order to get there. Like Taylor Sear has to modify the original Fisher and Revisa theory to get to that piece to show Franklin wrong. But I mean, I think he's still kind of correct. He does understand that Fisher hasn't necessarily conceded that, yes, I want to take out that reactivity is all of a piece part. Like Fisher still hasn't conceded that taking out part. Like he hasn't told Sear, oh right, we should take that piece out. So no ability to do otherwise is necessary. Is not necessary. As far as I know, Fisher still holds to his original theory with some slight modifications.
Yeah.
I think so, which means to show me, especially since he just conceded to Franklin in 2018 after Sear published this, that he's still very much a dispositional kind of compatibilist. Like he does believe some sort of ability is necessary in some sense. Although some compatibilists, like Sear, for instance, or Carolina Sartario is another one, will completely eradicate all alternatives, even dispositional, conditional, categorical. No alternatives are necessary. And, they can do them, that's fine. But Fisher's original theory, I think Finney's right here. There should be, at least with the reactivity part, there should be some sort of ability to do otherwise, at least dispositionally. Because that's what reactivity, at least how Fisher originally construed it, that's what reactivity means.
Okay.
So his sentence, Finney's sentence, to go all the way back, it's right, but also not.
That the
First,
whole
he's
time
going to
I'm
be
thinking
doing
is he's critiquing a view that, first of all, I don't know anything about Fisher's stuff. I only read
right.
some of Preciado's book. I haven't got through the whole thing. And second, he's arguing against that as a concept, basically saying that my concept is the same concept as that, and then arguing against that instead of what I'm saying necessarily. Which
Well,
I'm like,
even
how is it
yeah,
like it doesn't really
relevant.
apply to me that much? Like it's like adjacent and using some of the same source material, but he'd have to go back to something I specifically said and be like, I mean, he tries to, saying that Eve would have to have been able to react to other reasons that would point her in a different direction. I'm like, yeah, she could have, but she didn't care to. None of those other reasons were sufficient enough for her to go in a
Right.
different direction. Like God's commandment wasn't sufficient, and it should have been in her own mindset. But that doesn't mean that like the whole thing falls apart because for whatever reason Eve didn't stop to consider an alternative possibility. You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
I think it just goes to show how flexible the compatibilist position is because we can
Yeah.
have alternative possibilities if we want or
Yeah.
not. It doesn't matter. And I think Sear's argument for gutting Fisher and Revisa's that piece out of the theory and saying no ability to do otherwise is necessary. I think it works. So if and those are by the way are what called actual sequence compatibilists.
Yeah.
Um, or let's use a better term, strong actual sequence compatibilist, whereas Fisher is a weak actual sequence compatibilist. So actual sequence compatibilist goes back to Frankfurt in the actual sequence instead of the alternative sequence. Jones did not have the ability to do otherwise because of the counterfactual intervener, blah, blah, blah. We talked about all this. But uh, Fisher's still allowing for some wiggle room.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's called leeway.
Yeah.
So alternative possibilities, or better yet, the ability to do otherwise. Fisher's still giving some leeway there. That's literally what it's called in the literature, leeway compatibilism,
Mm-hmm.
having an ability to do otherwise. Fisher's okay with that, so I would call him a weak actual sequence compatibilist because he holds to some flimsy something of a dispositional ability in his reaction component of moderate reasons responsiveness. But Sear, other compatibilists, they do not. Does it matter? No.
Yeah.
So I think this what Finney's trying to say is maybe he's just trying to show off his guns that he knows the literature too.
Yeah. Which is, I
Well,
appreciate
which is
that, but
fine,
I,
but he needs to read Sear's article then.
yeah. Um, and that just made me think too, like, do I think in the existence of actual alternative possibilities? I can easily say yes or no to that question. It changes nothing about what I think about the
Ability
world.
to do otherwise. We all agree that alternatives are there.
Yeah.
One
And
caveat.
well, my thing would be like, whether they're there or not almost doesn't matter if you don't have the ability to. Like, they only exist in your mind conceptually as potential.
Epistemically.
Yeah. And so to me,
It's
just
simple.
with my like, it's dumb, but like if I want to throw quantum physics in there, if they exist only as a potential because you conceptualize them in some way and deliberate and think about and then choose and actualize one of them, I don't have to think that all of those alternative possibilities are actual like like brick and mortar, like exist in the physical
They're not, yeah,
world.
they're not categorical.
Yeah, like
And
I
Fisher
don't
does
think I have to admit to that, because essentially there's no way to prove that they exist unless you go back in time and run it and choose something else. Like,
which is the rollback argument, right?
yeah.
Um, that's fine. I don't. Fisher isn't committed to the categorical. No compatibilist ought to be committed to the
Yeah.
categorical.
I'm not going
At
to take
least
a hard stance on it away from it. But like one thing Razer said is like, how can you deliberate between alternative possibilities if alternative possibilities don't exist?
epistemic openness, Perry Boom's model. That's how.
Well, I wish I had that. Okay, anyways.
You did. You talked to Drew about it. Remember?
Well, yes, but it wasn't sufficient for Razer. So moving on.
That's insufficient stuff.
I
You can
know.
continue. I think this paragraph for Finny is fine. It's
it's
not
it,
really relevant,
it
but
feels
I
more
just
like a
want to.
flex, but and I
I just
appreciate that. Like, show me that you know what you're talking about, but I still need to get to the point where it matters to me personally in this argument.
he does
Yeah.
in the next
So
paragraph.
other reasons why I wouldn't vindicate a Calvinist view of moral responsibility. Whether we consider an agent reasons responsive would be based on the history of that agent's past choices.
We pause. Hold on.
Kinda.
The agent underneath Fisher and Revisa's view that's reasons responsive. It's the mechanism. So
The
they are a
history.
mechanism-based moral responsibility theory, not an agent-based. Again, I think Finney's just playing too fast with his words here. It's minor, but it's kind of important. Now, I'm totally cool with holding an agent-based theory.
Yeah.
There's reasons that we can hold to an agent-based theory, but generally, I want to say that like it does matter if we want to get into the weeds of moral responsibility and reasons responsiveness. It does matter, especially if we have to bring up Frankfurt style examples. But
Well, I feel like this is included in my definition when I say experiences. Just throwing that out
right,
there. So if Eve always makes the wrong choice in any scenario, as would be the case in transworld deprivation, assuming that's a coherent concept, which, side note, thank you for setting aside, what is it called? An unknown or unresolved, like, philosophical or theological point just for the sake of argument. Drew, take notes, learn how to do this. That is so helpful because it's not the point of what we're
I
talking
love
about.
Finny.
He's just like, okay, like I'll give you that, but even if that's true, she's not reasons responsive because she couldn't have chose others. He's saying the same thing. I guess this is the point where he brings it into my
This
world.
is where it's kind of weird. So he's saying whether we consider an agent reasons. I'm gonna just say, okay, for the sake of argument, I'm gonna say agent, not mechanism. The agent, reasons responsive, would be based on the history of the agent's past choices. So he's saying, and truly, what he's saying is Fish and Revisa's view is a historical view. What that means is the history of how you come about your reasons matter. So it's called historicism, where
Okay.
it's basically this idea of, if you were just overtly manipulated out of the blue directly right now, would you be responsible? No, because you did not take ownership of that mechanism. Whereas if it started, and this kind of goes into manipulation cases, which I'll kind of put to the side for now, but if it started way back when you were like in the womb and you just adopted that mechanism as your own, then that's a different story and it drives with our intuitions a little bit differently. So Fish and Revisa talk about how they actually argue against Frankfurt's original view of a non-historical notion of freedom of the will. They argue for a historical notion, and I think that's what Finney's saying, but it's not quite sure. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I think he's saying is in order whether we consider if we want to consider Eve to be responsive, reasons responsive, then we have to consider her past. Okay,
Which
so
we don't
if Eve
have.
always right, if Eve always, and then he says if Eve always made the wrong choice in any scenario, that's what deprivation would say.
Yeah.
Then she's not reasons responsive. I don't see how that follows.
I don't either.
I don't.
That's where I was kind of a bit confused. But should
Uh,
we just move on with what he says next? Maybe that clears it up. I don't know.
No, it's a
Uh,
different thing. But I kind of want to talk a bit about it, like,
okay.
because if it, I think what he's saying is Eve did not have any, like, she was innocent until up until she ate of the fruit. So she didn't have any history backing up that decision. But then again, or Adam didn't have any history backing up that decision. But I don't think I think the issue that Finney has here is he has a strong notion of history, whereas I think he doesn't need to. He's almost, I don't know, it almost seems like he's importing sort of in the literature called a morally significant history, but that is only compatible with incompatibilism.
Yeah.
So to me, it seems like he's even unintentionally kind of wiggling his incompatibilism in here, which I mean, that's fine, but I
Yeah.
don't see how it follows that she's then not reasons responsive when I don't even need that incompatibilist history to
Yeah.
begin with. Or Eve doesn't need the incompatibilist history to begin with. So I think she is reasons responsive. As you explained in your OP, she had reasons
Yeah.
why she did what she did. She's an intelligent creature. She didn't know what like lying was or deception was. She took evidence from the serpent, even if it was crappy evidence. She
She
took it
took
as
it as
evidence.
fact.
She thought about it. She deliberated it, all in
Hmm.
a compatibilist framework. She was reasons responsive here, I think.
Yeah.
There's nothing that demonstrates to me that she's not. Now, the transworld deprivation part, he says, would always make the wrong choice in any scenario. Like Eve would always make the wrong choice in any scenario. That would be the case of transworld deprivation. Um, I think he's trying to relate it to the weak reactivity, like
Yeah.
there's alternative possibilities, or rather, inability to do otherwise. But the alternative possibilities are still intact, even if transworld deprivation is true. They still have reasons there. The existence of reasons are still there
Yeah.
in any world, even if transworld deprivation is true. It doesn't matter. And the weakly reactive component, even if I negate Seer and hold to Fisher and Revisa's original theory of weakly reaction, which then entails a dispositional ability, she still had a dispositional ability there. But I don't understand why she wouldn't have a dispositional ability to do otherwise in a different circumstance, because she doesn't have the ability to not sin, right? But she could have if maybe he tempted her with a different apple, or he
Yeah. If the
tempted her in a
circumstances were
different way,
different,
it
then
would still be true that she
yeah.
has this, as positional compatibilists say, the wide ability to do otherwise. And
Yeah.
if she still has the wide ability to do otherwise, she has a narrow ability to do otherwise. And if that's the case, then weakly reactivity is still there. It's still uphold. None of those are negated. So I think what he's saying is weak reaction in the moderate reasons responsiveness entails a dispositional ability. He's saying the dispositional ability would not be there if transorder deprivation is true. So therefore, the weak reaction part would not be there. Therefore, she's not reason responsive. Therefore, it doesn't seem like Eve is therefore morally responsible. That's how I see that argument playing. And
Yeah.
I just like to say, I don't know. I don't see how the dispositional is negated here. So none of that follows. That's all I
Yeah.
wanted to say there.
So
I don't know if you understood any of that, but
I kind of did. Like I'm getting bits and pieces enough to know that it doesn't quite line up the way
let's
that
start
he thinks it
here
does.
because I'm going to use these terms a lot actually. Two different kinds of dispositions, wide and
Okay.
narrow.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't familiar with this concept.
So Fisher uses general and specific. Sear uses general and specific dispositions and ability, general ability, specific ability. Vivellen, an actual compatibilist who does hold to leeway compatibilism or dispositional compatibilism, holds to, and she argues for the terms wide and narrow. What is narrow? Narrow ability is a disposition or an ability that says you have the know how, the resources, or the psychological intrinsic properties to do the thing. So, like, for me, I know how to play guitar, right? So, I know how to play guitar. If someone gave me a guitar, I could play it. But let's just say I'm on a plane, right? I don't have a guitar. Is it is it wrong for me to tell a stranger, "Yeah, I know how to play the guitar. I can play the guitar. I have the ability to play the guitar." Is it wrong for me to say that to a stranger on a plane?
No.
The answer is intuitively no.
Yeah.
Why? Vivelin says that I have the narrow ability to do otherwise. I have that ability to play guitar. I have the know-how, the resources, the psychological structure, the physical capacity, like my hands are used to it, my fingers are used to it, blah, blah, blah. I've been playing for years. I can play it. What's the wide ability? The wide ability is the narrow ability plus suitable surrounding circumstances. What that means is, or sometimes it's called a wide range of suitable possible worlds in which I do that thing if I were to attempt to do that thing. What does that mean? I have a guitar in the room right now. I'm looking right at it. It's beautiful. It's a Taylor, right?
So
Quilted
jealous.
maple. It's luscious. uh, if I wanted to right now, could I play the guitar? Right. So I can play the guitar because I have the narrow ability, but I also can play the guitar because I have an environment in which a guitar is present. So I have the wide ability, the environment in which the guitar is present. I have the opportunity. That's what sometimes the wide ability is called, the
Yeah.
opportunity to actually play the guitar. But I also have the know-how, I have the resources, I have the psychological disposition to do it. Both those abilities are necessary underneath Vivelin's view in order for one to be free and responsible. Okay. And for me, I love that. I think it's super intuitive to me that both of those are necessary for free will. In other words, you wouldn't blame me if if you say, like, if I didn't have a guitar at the plane in a plane, and you're like, "Oh, play my favorite song," and I'm like, "Oh, I can't." But I mean, I can play the guitar, but I can't right now because I don't have the wide ability in the plane, right? I don't have the suitable circumstances. You would be like, you would it would be impossible for you to say like, "How dare you, you dirty,
You
rotten
liar.
person." Yeah,
Yeah.
like, "You don't know how to play the guitar. How can"
If you knew how to play the
No,
guitar,
none
you
of
play
that
the guitar right
blaming.
now.
No, yeah, you cannot blame me because I didn't have the opportunity. I didn't have the circumstances for it.
Yeah.
Right. To me, this is very close to the conditional ability to do otherwise, like extremely close to it. And to me, it's a little bit better. And so when we're talking about dispositions in the rest of this thread, a lot of those are going to come up. So I just wanted to explain them, but I hope that makes sense there.
You talk so much, dude. I get I get tired just listening to you. Physically, I have like a reaction of like time for bed, cold and stalking.
No worries.
Just right now, I'm just super tired. So next is reasons responsiveness also undercuts the Calvinist doctrine of imputed guilt. Since
Um,
Adam's progeny, is that how you say that?
yeah,
Colton, what's progeny? Quick
just like
definition.
his parental, he's like our patriarch. So his lineage, his children,
Do not
his
satisfy the owner mechanism requirement for responsibility. What? It also undermines imputed guilt because it requires the subjective element to responsibility. The agent must see himself as a morally responsive agent in order to hold her as such, to exclude people who are suffering from cognitive disabilities or lack of self-awareness. That's not true.
So
Infants, hold
yeah,
on. Infants do not meet either owner mechanism or subjective self-ascription requirement for responsibility under Fisher's theory.
so okay, first, undercuts the Calvinist doctrine of imputed guilt, since Adam's progeny do not satisfy the owner mechanism requirement for responsibility. Uh, no, that doesn't follow. And I've
Yeah.
already talked to him about this, and actually Preciado has a short section in which he explains why this doesn't follow. He calls it at the end of chapter 4. Literally his last section, I think. It's called the problem of imputed guilt or something like that. Um, And basically, he says this, and I remember talking to Finney about this years ago, and I like Preciado's view, but actually, this is kind of like an Easter egg. One of the first persons I've actually used the word transworld deprivation against is Finney, and that was like 3 years ago. That was even before I started talking to you about it, Shmez.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of it's a new idea, and I was trying to think about it, and so I was like, well, he's a good guinea pig, yeah.
Smart guy.
But basically, Preciado, to going back, he says Adam's guidance control is our guidance control. He is
Okay.
our federal head. So really, he's just complaining about federal headship. If he wants to think that this is a good argument, just argue against federal headship because Calvinists are going to see it as a good argument. And I see it too. Whatever Adam was, as of representing our federal head, we would also do that. Now, I then come in because Preciado just leaves it at that. It's kind of unsatisfactory. But I would come in and say, well, why does that work? Why is that like a good reason? Because of transworld deprivation. Because it doesn't matter if you were there, Finney was there, I was there, Millie was there, your daughter, your son, whatever, any person
Don't
was
throw them
there.
into this.
They would do the same thing.
Ah.
They would do the same thing. It's this kind of tongue-in-cheek sort of thing when you're in Bible school or Sunday school and you talk, or maybe Sunday morning in a Baptist church, and the preacher's going to town bashing against Israel. But then at the end of the day, he's like, but wait, I'm bashing against Israel, but you have to understand, we would do the same thing that Israel does. We can't say that, oh, Israel, you're so stupid. Why did you do that? Golden calf, you serious? He just brought you out of. But you would do the same. Right. It's called
Nah, bro.
transworld deprivation.
I beat Joseph.
That's what I say. So I don't think that it does not follow that we don't own our mechanism. We may not own our mechanism with regards to that specific moral sin, but we own the so we may not be morally responsible, right? But we own the mechanism with regards to that racial sin, and that we do and are morally responsible, which is exactly why infants die, which is exactly why the
Cancer
cognitive
exists.
impaired die, because they do own that mechanism of racial guilt. That guilt is imputed to us in Adam's progeny, but not the moral guilt. That's not imputed to us until we actually sin. And
Yeah.
we've already explained all this on the podcast last time
Yeah.
I checked. Yeah.
So it's like he may not be, in a sense, morally responsible, like in our terms of between racial and
Right.
moral guilt, but the racial guilt is why he has owner mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
What?
So
I'm
are you
confusing myself.
racially responsible, or are you morally responsible? I claim that we are racially responsible when we are born.
Yeah. Just by
Why?
we're
Because
humans
we're
because of Adam.
humans, and we would have done the same thing that Adam did if we grew up and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Right? That's the transworld deprivation part that's kind of kicking in. So he may not like that response. And in fact, I actually know exactly what he's going to say. He's going to say that the Westminster does not allow for that. He's going to say that Reformed theology does not allow for that imputed guilt to not be moral. And so, to preempt that response, he's going to appeal to Chapter 6 of the Westminster, uh, Part 3. So, Chapter 6.3. Now, for the record, I know you don't care about this.
I don't.
And honestly, I don't even know why I have to bring it up, but I know that Finney, as a man who studied Reformed theology a lot, he has this idea of what Reformed theology is and what it must be. And I just like to push a friendly nudge and say, that does not follow. So he's going to appeal to the Westminster saying, but Reformed theology must be this. And I agree that Reformed theology, even if you, Shemez, disagree, I agree that Reformed theology is pretty much based on the Westminster Confession of Faith. But chapter 6, which is titled Of the Fall of Man, of Sin, and the Punishment Thereof, part 3 or point 3 says, I quote, "They," meaning Adam's progeny, "being the root of mankind, the guilt of this sin being was imputed, and the same death and sin and corrupted nature conveyed to all their posterity." Oh, sorry. They meaning Adam and Eve,
Yeah.
our first parents, but to all their posterity. So Adam and Eve's
All their
posterity, which
children.
is us.
Yeah.
And then it goes on, descending from them by original generation. Verse 4, "From this original corruption, whereby we were utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil, do proceed all actual transgressions." Okay, what does this mean?
That sounds a lot
It means
like
this.
racial guilt.
To me, this is just saying racial guilt. It does not say at all moral guilt. And I'm going to pull Oliver Crisp here and try to broaden the Reformed theology camp, because I think verse 4 is very clear. They make a distinction between original sin, original corruption, and actual transgressions. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. What's the original corruption part? The racial guilt part.
Yeah.
What was the actual transgressions part that proceed after they were already inclined to do evil, after the original corruption? What was the actual transgressions part? The moral guilt. That's when the moral responsibility of mechanism ownership kicks in, usually when they're like, a kid or something like that, given their reasoned responsiveness and not cognitively impaired, blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
That's when that actually kicks in. To me, the Westminster does not, and this is, if he's going to point against saying Reformed theology doesn't allow for your distinction between racial and moral, I just like to point him to this and be like, show
There you
me
go.
where this. And verse 6 is actually even more specific. It says every sin, both original and actual. It makes a distinction between original corruption, or the inclination of evil, or what I call racial guilt. That's the original part. And then it makes that distinction with that and actual sin, actual transgression, which is the moral part, the actual doing of this is from me, I choose this. Adam may not have watched pornography or slapped Eve in the face. I'm not saying I slapped my wife in the face,
I was gonna
or that
say.
I'm dead bent in watching pornography right now. But what I'm saying is that this is actual. Like they're making a contrast in the Westminster between actual and original corruption. Actual corruption to me is the moral guilt. Original corruption to me is the racial guilt. There's nothing against this in Reformed theology, so far as I can tell. So, no, to go back, I don't see how imputed guilt somehow just doesn't satisfy the owner mechanism requirement.
Yeah.
That undercuts it. It doesn't follow to me.
So my response to him, I don't know if I can't remember if I did a good job or not, but I said basically what I'm explaining isn't Fisher's model of reasons responsiveness, but Preciado builds on his work for sure and introduces moderate reasons responsiveness as opposed to weak or strong. This is all to explain why Eve chose to sin, but by no means does it morally justify it. She, in theory, could have trusted God and could have been a sufficient reason to not sin, but based on her understanding of reality, based on her experience, knowledge, disposition, it wasn't. So disposition explained by transworld deprivation. Yes, for the sake of argument, let's assume it's coherent. Experience is lack of experience, and knowledge is the desire to know more. Plus, God's absence is all the reasons why she sinned. It explains it, yes. Justifies it, not at all. Fair?
I don't know what you mean by justifies it.
Because he was trying to say that one of the first parts was saying that it actually implies that her decision was morally justified. And I said all this setup is just to explain the reasons why she chose what she chose. I'm not morally justifying it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that was like the
I
first.
think that's right. Yeah,
That was a
it
long
does
time
explain.
ago, but that's what I was referring to.
Yeah.
and she would have been able to have an alternative possibility if alternative
Right.
reasons were present. If a
That's true.
variable changes, then the process would start over again, maybe with a different outcome. The only way that there are alternate possibilities is if there are alternate reasons. Since there wasn't, and never would be unless we go back in time and introduce new information to the variables, the outcome is always the same. Fair?
Yeah, I guess we'll see what he says, but
Yeah.
I don't see any issue right now.
If Eve always makes the wrong choice in any scenario, well, the only scenario where she wouldn't is if God is present and assisting, given this environment. If the snake wasn't there, she probably never would have even considered eating the fruit. If the tree wasn't there, obviously she wouldn't have been able to eat from it. Transworld deprivation only says that she was deprived, but that deprivation maybe wouldn't have been exposed without the tree, the snake, or God's absence. So alternate possibilities would be possible in an alternate world without these conditions. But this was the only scenario presented, so to me there isn't much reason to mull over the what ifs, but either way, I don't think you need alternative possibilities to have moral responsibility. That's a topic for another discussion. I think Frankfurt style cases help explain.
So what you probably meant though is that you don't need the ability to do otherwise to
What did
have
I say?
moral
You don't need
alternative
alternate.
possibilities.
Yeah, well,
But-
I kind of lumped those together. I didn't really consider the distinction
right.
until today. So,
Which is
yes.
fine. And just for the audience, I think that
Yes.
we need to pull those apart.
Yeah. No, if I would have worded it differently with now understanding what you said today, which is new information I really didn't think about
Right.
before. In moderate reasons responsiveness upholds owner mechanisms and thus upholds responsibility. But in this case, it's awkward because we can safely assume Adam and Eve, like infants, had no knowledge of good and evil and therefore weren't considering themselves moral agents. They had no concept of it. But they were still given a commandment, so they knew what not to do, which is why I think God considered it a moral decision. It doesn't violate their owner mechanism. Although unaware of a lot of the reasons not to, they were aware of God's
Right.
commandment, although misunderstood.
I love
Someone with,
that
oh, thank
personally.
God.
Like
Oh,
to me, like I really love that. That's a really great distinction. So it doesn't seem like at first glance that they were moral agents because they had no concept of it. And I think
that's
it's
fair.
true.
Yes.
But at the same time, if they were not moral agents, why did God give them a moral command? He gave them
Yes.
more than one moral command. He said, "Do all this, keep the garden, cleave to each other."
Subdue. Yeah.
Name right, but also don't eat of that tree. So he
Yeah.
gave them a couple, I think, or at least 2 or 3 positive commands, positive moral commands, and I would classify that as moral. Uh, specifically, if you don't do it, there's going to be moral consequences. But and then one negative moral command. He would not give them the moral commands if they were not moral agents, or perhaps they were not moral agents until he gave them moral commands. It doesn't matter either way. They were moral agents
Yeah.
when they sinned. So to me, they were morally responsible. They owned their mechanism. They were reasons responsive, even if we hold to a dispositional weak reaction part
Yeah.
of that moderate reasons responsive. It doesn't matter. They were still. That's. I love that.
Awesome. I'm glad I did something smart. Okay, so you're obviously aware of Fisher's work. Preciado builds on it, makes it usable in Compatibilism. If you haven't read his book, find it helpful. Because I saw him talking about Fisher a lot, but not Preciado, and I'm like, did you read his book? Like, I wasn't aware.
Preciado, right? Preciado has a few things to say that is not
Yeah,
outside of Fisher and Revise's realm. One of them I just told you that
yeah,
Adam's guidance control is our guidance control. I found that unsatisfactory, so transworld deprivation, here you go. But either way, yeah. But the general idea of moderate reasons responsiveness, Preciado and Fisher will virtually have the same
yeah.
thing.
Okay, that's fair. I just said that because I wasn't sure if he was, because he's arguing about something in people that I'm not even talking about, even though they are very
Right.
similar. Okay, so Finny responds, and she would have been able to have alternate possibilities if alternate reasons were present. This is a dispositional conception of alternate possibilities. Hence, why reasons responsiveness requires at least a dispositional sense of ability to do otherwise.
Agreed. We already said that. So first, I would say this is a dispositional conception of ability to do otherwise,
Yep.
not alternative possibilities. At best, it's an epistemic, categorical epistemic conception of alternative possibilities, but categorical epistemic openness is perfectly compatible with compatibilism, as Boom argues. It's the categorical metaphysical alternative possibilities that we cannot have. And so the dispositional conception, at least epistemically, is compatible. And even the dispositional sense of the ability to do otherwise is still compatible. I agree, Finny.
Okay, cool.
What's the point?
Yeah. The only other way there are alternate possibilities if there were alternate reasons. That's why I said. He responds, well, do you mean this in a normative sense, good reasons to obey God, or in the actual sense of considerations that influenced Eve? I guess to directly answer that question, what? I don't know what you
I
mean.
think
What's normative
I
sense?
would say good reasons to obey God in a normative sense.
Okay. What is normative sense? Like what?
Normative is just like it's prescribed, like it's moral.
Okay.
So that's why he says in the next sentence, if it's normative, then her action was morally justified. Which, but we would agree. I mean, her action was morally justified in
In
the
her
sense that
in her own
it
mind.
was right. It was morally justified in her own mind. She's morally responsible. Mechanism ownership, all that goes through. Good.
Well,
That's
see
what I
that
would claim.
I think that's what I got hung up on a little bit is he kept mentioning it was morally justified. I'm like, well, obviously not in God's sense, but in her own sense, it was morally justified. But what do we
Right.
care what she thinks? Like, why does that matter? That doesn't do anything to my argument. That just shows she's depraved, like sinful. Yeah, we all know that. Like, what's the point of mentioning it? Um, in the latter, then I think you're simply misunderstood the reasons responsive. To be reasons responsive, alternate reasons do not have to be present. It's a hypothetical ability to do otherwise. It's simply that she was able to act on another reason had the reason presented itself to her.
She says it when he says, and I agree, but when he says alternative reasons do not have to be present, what he means is alternative reasons do not have to be categorical or in the actual sequence. Again, Finney playing too loose with his words here, because when he says do not have to be present, what does it mean to be present?
Yeah.
Epistemic alternative reasons are present. Epistemically, they're present, even in Jones in the actual sequence, if we take an agent-based theory, which is fine. So he has to be a little careful with his words, but I would agree.
Okay.
But you didn't even, at least as far as I know, you didn't mean the latter, the influenced by Eve part, whatever. You meant the former in the normative sense. I mean in the former in the normative sense. So the whole paragraph is just conceded to me. It's fine.
But if you're relying on transworld deprivation, such that given roughly the same circumstances, Eve would have never done the right thing, then she does not have reasons responsiveness.
Again, I don't see how that follows. She
Yeah.
has dispositional ability, right?
For her
So
to have reasons responsiveness implies that had the reason presented itself to her, she occasionally does the right thing. I think.
no. What I don't know what I'm missing. For her to have, what he says is for her to have the reasons responsiveness implies, had the reason presented itself, she occasionally does the right thing. But the reasons wouldn't have presented itself. So I don't see why she doesn't need the reason to do the right thing. She doesn't need a morally significant reason. She just needs reasons that, and she does have those reasons. She went from the evidence, it tracked the objective evidence, even though the evidence is crap because it came from Satan, and we all
Yeah.
agree with that. But it's still evidence to her, and it was still good evidence to her. And so she
Trustworthy
ate based on
evidence.
evidence, right? And she trusted the snake, and that's fine. That's all reasons responsiveness. Maybe like I don't get what he's trying to say here because to me it just doesn't follow. So maybe he can explain a little bit more if he
Yeah.
posts it,
Yeah.
but me, I just don't see how it follows.
So he quotes me, they were given a commandment so they knew what not to do, which is why I think God considered a moral decision and doesn't violate their owner mechanism. So he says, I think you're confusing the subject element with mechanism ownership element.
They're literally the exact same thing.
Even if
I
they owned the mechanism, which they did in a literal sense, because the sequence of events, they actually did choose to eat the fruit. They didn't satisfy the subject element because, as you agree, they did not view themselves as moral agents having no knowledge of good and evil.
No, 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 no. I mean, did you agree with that? I don't think that's what you agreed to. I don't think because we just went over your response, right?
Yeah, I
And
didn't agree.
you're saying that it may be, how I read you is that it may be the case, but God still gave a moral commandment, which
Yeah,
means they're moral agents.
yeah, it
This is
doesn't.
why we don't give moral commandments to infants, because they're not moral agents, because they're not
Yeah.
reasoned responsiveness. Right?
So,
So,
like, they did not view themselves as moral agents having no knowledge of good and evil. My argument was that it doesn't matter because God gave them a moral charge and God viewed the decision as a moral decision. So I don't
and so
care.
they should then, therefore,
Yeah.
I think it follows, and actually Preciado argues it too, based on the evidence, because that is a source condition. So the source condition or the mechanism ownership condition is that you have to be a prime candidate of reactive attitudes. So if you give a moral commandment, you're a prime candidate of resentment towards, I don't know, God or wrath,
Yeah.
indignation. They are prime candidates of God's indignation if they do not do what they need to do. Okay, so that's satisfied. The next condition is that they have to view themselves as a source capable of making consequences in the world. I mean, we only have like what, one chapter, two chapters of them, but I would be hard pressed to try to argue that they did not view themselves as that. They viewed themselves as a source capable of making decisions in the world, I think.
I think
So,
too.
and then the third condition of mechanism ownership is that it's based on the evidence from what they've had. And Preciado specifically says, based on the sensus divinitatis that God has given them as being made in the image bearer, the sense of the divine as an image bearer, they know that they are morally held accountable because God has given them a commandment.
Yes.
Not
That's
just
all
not
they need.
just a general revelation commandment, although they had that. So Romans 1, for instance, but they also had a special revelation commandment. Do this and don't do that. They were definitely moral agents. They
Yeah.
definitely satisfied the subjective element. And I don't know why he says the subjective element with mechanism ownership. They mean the exact same thing. Fisher and Revisa mean the exact same thing. Preciado means the same thing. And Preciado talked to Fisher in order to make the book and to make sure that he actually checked off on some of this, uh, how he used, how he paraphrased some of the stuff. Apparently, as far as I know, he was completely okay with it. Fisher was okay
Yeah.
with Preciado saying the subjective part was the mechanism ownership part. So
So when he's saying I'm
Finney's wrong
confusing
here.
subject element with mechanism ownership element, it's like, no, you're confusing the two. Anyways,
They're synonymous.
yeah, he read Fisher's and Preciado's book. It's good stuff. I do like how compatibilists try to develop constructive approaches to the account of moral responsibility. I don't think they're sufficient, but many of their ideas I've adopted as my own understanding of what is necessary for moral responsibility. Cool. So I just said I'm not an expert. I'm kind of being introduced to the concept. Colton wanted to talk about this in our next recording, be able to answer some questions, clear up any confusion I may have caused. Which, looking back, I didn't do as bad of a job as I thought I did. So kudos to me. Tap myself on the back.
Right.
Um, Colton and I discussed this in the past, especially with respect to how imputed guilt could exist even if a moderate reasons responsive to models. I don't think it could. We've already touched on that. So I told him, if
Right.
you have any other questions, drop it here. So this was the last thing he said. I'm curious if source compatibilists, semi-compatibilists generally address arguments for the necessity of the ability to do otherwise. Source
Yeah, they do.
compatibilists focus exclusively on the actual sequence of events leading to a choice, and following Frankfurt reject the need for the ability to do otherwise. I think I've shown above that Fisher needs at least a dispensational ability to do otherwise to make sense of
Right.
reactivity. But
Right.
more generally, how do Fisher address moral responsibility in the following case without appealing to alternate possibilities. So here's the
Yeah, hold
case.
on, I'm gonna stop. So, because that's a good case, but beforehand, yes, Finny, if he's ever listening or watching this,
I think he will.
source compatibilists, there's, like I kind of already explained, there's a couple of different source incompatibilists. And it's very similar to Tempe's source incompatibilist distinctions because there's a narrow source incompatibilist and a wide source incompatibilist. Narrow says no ability to do otherwise is necessary, like Stump, Hunt, William Lane Craig, Zagzebski. And then Tempe is a wide source incompatibilist who says some alternative possibilities are necessary. True for source compatibilists. There's some source compatibilists who I called them weak, but I guess I could keep Tempe's verbiage and vocabulary and call them wide. So wide source compatibilists and say there are some who do believe that yes, everything's in the actual sequence, but there's some ability to do otherwise. That's like Fisher. I'm kind of in that camp too, if you haven't already figured it out. But there's like Fisher believes that, yeah, I think there's some ability to do otherwise, even if you have an actual sequence. But not all source compatibilists do think that. Let's just call them narrow source compatibilists. Those are like Carolina Sotario or Michael McKenna. No, Michael McKenna is probably more wide. But Taylor Sear, Taylor Sear, the article that we went through, he's more of like a narrow. He doesn't believe any ability to do otherwise is even remotely necessary. So I just wanted to explain that before we get to the case.
So I didn't even read this case yet. I wanted to save it
Cool.
for the show. So I might just give my initial thoughts on it. Just, how I do, just pulling it off the top of my head. Paraplegic by a river sees a person floating down the stream, unable to swim. Paraplegic does nothing. Supposing there was nothing he could do, he was still the owner of the mechanism that led him to choose to do nothing, but we would intuitively think he's not responsible since he was not able to do otherwise. I'm not claiming that a libertarian sense of alternate possibility is necessary, but I would think that some kind of alternate possibility is necessary, whether cached in dispensational or conditional terms.
Right.
So let me see. What is the question here? Is he responsible for?
How would Fisher address the responsibility in the following case without appealing to alternative possibilities?
How would Fisher address moral responsibility? Okay, so the paraplegic obviously isn't morally responsible
For
because
saving the man.
because they didn't have the ability to save the man, but he still
That's what he wants to argue.
but he still chose to do nothing. So that would make so he chose to do nothing but also couldn't do anything. So we would intuitively think he's not he's not responsible since he wasn't able to do otherwise. So in this case, I would have to agree. I don't find him morally responsible, but I would be like, you didn't even try to throw a stick or something floating. There was,
Right.
but this whole thing assumes that he had it in his good graces to even think about or consider it in the first place to try.
Right.
He could have sat there and just laughed his butt off that guy was about to die because, who knows what was going through his head. So this doesn't really explain that there was an attempt or a deliberation or an honest consideration of the present events that would make him honestly consider that he could, or how could he help. Anyone has a phone and can call, so if I really want to nitpick this, he could have done something regardless, or just yelled or made a ruckus to get someone else's attention, but he chose to do nothing. But we don't know why what were the reasons he chose to do nothing. So based on the reasons, we could actually hold him morally responsible if we knew the reasons. Without knowing the reasons, Do I have to assume he's not morally responsible? I don't have to assume anything if I don't know the reasons.
Right.
So just because he wasn't able to do otherwise doesn't mean he couldn't have considered the possibility. Yeah, no, I can't answer without knowing his reasons. I can't answer that one way or the other.
There's two possible responses. First, your response is good, um, unless we actually know what he's thinking and how he could be responsible, reasons responsive in a deterministic world for how he responded. Maybe he threw a stick, maybe he called the cops. He is responsible, reasons responsive to what he can do,
Yes.
but we don't know what that is, and so it depends on the phrase. Supposing there was nothing he could do, you know, he was still the owner of the mechanism that led him to choose to do nothing. That kind of phrase, that led him to choose to do nothing. What does it mean by led him to choose to do nothing? Did he do nothing because physically, because he's a paraplegic? Well, obviously,
Yeah.
he's not responsible for, and this is what Van Inwagen says is event particulars in event consequences or event universals. Sorry, event universals. And just to let you know, Fisher and Revisa respond to that, and it's called Responsibility for Consequences in their 1998 book, Responsibility and Control. And I think they bring up something very similar to this case. So maybe I'd encourage Finny, if I remember correctly, they do kind of adjust their own philosophy based on cases like this. I think they would still hold him responsible in the event universal that he could have tried to do something. That's what Finn and Wagon calls like the principle of possible prevention, or the trying, the attempt, or whatever, the flicker of freedom there. I don't know. Just the idea of trying. Yeah, he could do something there, but you can't do anything physically. The event particular is not available to him.
Yeah.
That's one way to respond to it. And I think that's what you said pretty much.
Yeah,
Um,
cuz he's responsible up to the level of his ability to do something. So if he has a phone, he should call. If he has a voice, he should yell. If he could reach a stick, he should throw it. So
right.
those, we don't know in the circumstances what's around him, but him choosing to do absolutely nothing to me seems very weird. And I'd be
Right.
very suspicious to say that he's not morally responsible, because I feel like
So,
if you're
right.
being interviewed by a cop, they would have been like, why didn't you call sooner? Why didn't, like, they would hammer you, like, why did you choose to do nothing? And given his response to that question, they might be, this is a horrible person who just, like, sat by and did nothing while this person died. And, like, they didn't care to even try to do anything. They would be very mad about that. But if this guy was like, oh, I couldn't find his stick, like, I yelled, but no one's around. My phone was dead. I didn't have it on me. Like, all I could do was look on in horror. Then, yeah, those specific reasons, like, there is an attempt, you know, to the level of his
I
present
I don't, yeah,
abilities.
so that's one possible response. I don't think that's the response he's getting at, though, mainly because he says that last phrase,
Yeah.
but we would intuitively think he's not responsible, and I don't think Finney's so dumb to not think about that. So I think that he's just kind of, again, just being really fast, trying to show the case, because he does conclude, since he wasn't able to do otherwise, not to attempt, not to try, but to do otherwise physically. And
Yeah.
so to me, let's do a charitable interpretation, do it the other way.
Sure.
He does, and in that case, if that's the case, like he can't do anything because he's a paraplegic, he is intuitively not responsible, then yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
But I don't see how that goes against Fisher's view. Even if it did go against Fisher's view, I think already showed that Fisher concedes. Again, he conceded it in 2018 to Franklin's article that's published in 2015, in spite of Sears' recommendation for modifying Fisher's theory, which he published in 2017. Fisher says, yeah, I think dispositional ability is necessary for freedom and responsibility. Yeah, for sure. He concedes
Well,
Franklin's argument.
well,
So then
what's crazy is, like,
so
now
this
that I'm
is
looking
not
at it,
an issue.
he was still the owner of the mechanism that led him to choose to do nothing. But we would intuitively think that he's not responsible. So, like, to me, like, if you want to go through the Preciado's framework of moderate reasons responsiveness, he could have went through all of his reasons to try. And if he, being charitable, there's absolutely nothing that he could have done. That was the sufficient reason for him to do nothing. And that made him not morally responsible in his own eyes, which is,
No, he's morally responsible for not doing anything because he has sufficient reason to say
to not do
no.
anything, right? Are you losing your thought?
Now, yeah, I no, I mean I had it, but it didn't quite make sense. He's not morally responsible for getting up and helping the man
Yes.
because he can't. But he is morally responsible for trying to do something.
Yes.
And I think he is, and we would say he is morally responsible for trying to do something, and he owns the mechanism, and he was moderate reason responsive
Yeah.
to the reasons of him trying to do something. I could try to do this, I could try to do that. That reason's coming in, that reason's could I call the police? Could I try to throw a stick? He's morally responsible in that. Let's grant that in the case. Then yeah,
Okay.
I would also grant to Finney, right, he's intuitively not morally responsible for trying to get up and save the man. Now, let's add our last caveat there. To me, I think Finney's trying to point at something rather interesting here. I do think that the source compatibilists ought to allow some wiggle room for dispositions. That they, in other words, they shouldn't be a complete narrow source compatibilist or a complete actual sequence narrow compatibilist like Sartario or Sear. They should allow for some wiggle room here, like Fisher. And
What do you
Fisher agrees.
What do you mean by wiggle room?
Wiggle room as in like dispositional room. Like, yes, uh, Jones in the actual sequence is morally responsible because of moderate reasons responsiveness, ownership of the mechanism. But that weak reaction part requires a dispositional ability to do otherwise. So that's what he's saying. AP alternative possibilities down there. I'm not claiming that a libertarian view of alternative possibilities is necessary, although I do argue that it is. But I would think that some kind of alternative possibilities is necessary, whether cashed out in dispositional and conditional. I agree, Finney. Right. I agree. And so does Fisher. But not all compatibilists agree. So
Yeah.
maybe this is more of an issue towards some other compatibilists, but I think I agree with Finney. Yeah, he wouldn't be responsible because he couldn't do otherwise, even if he had wanted to do otherwise. That's the conditional. Or he wouldn't be responsible because he doesn't have the wide ability to do otherwise. Or, sorry. Oh, yeah, he doesn't have the wide ability to do otherwise. But he doesn't have the wide ability to do otherwise, namely the opportunity to save the man. Why? Because he doesn't even have the narrow ability to do otherwise.
Yeah.
Why? Because he doesn't even possess the physical strength to save the man.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the dispositional leeway compatibilism helps win the day here over staunch, hardcore, narrow source compatibilists like Sartario
Yeah.
or Sear. So
So a lot of what Finney kind of brought up, all good points, but it's almost like he's arguing against people's frameworks that he's read in the books instead of the particulars of what I'm putting forward and trying to say, which is fine because he doesn't know everything that I know or believe, and I did name drop Preciado, um, so he's just kind of
thing is, only good arguments are against the imputed guilt part. Um, that's a pretty hefty argument. Or when he says infants do not meet either the ownership condition or the subjective self-ascription requirements for responsibility. Um, yeah, for moral responsibility for sure, but they do, I would contend, meet the ownership condition of racial guilt.
yeah.
So that's really his only arguments that he has against. Everything else was kind of like fluff that I already agree with. So it doesn't really matter.
Well, I think we did a fairly good job on that. I love this framework though because you could literally apply it anywhere. like with any situation and trying to like dissect reasons why people do things, and I just find it really cool. Um, but yeah, I don't know.
Gold standard of compatibilism is what people say.
I'm so glad
So
we took that like hour to like really nail down so I can internalize for my own idiot self what it means and why it's so awesome and useful, which it really is useful. Um so we're done with that topic. Like we're done,
right.
right? So
Yep.
is there anything else that we want to like mention or just talk about, or thoughts, feelings, hopes, dreams, anything on your mind, Colton?
I guess in kind of light of what we talked about, there is one small thing. I kind of already mentioned it just briefly on the last comment, but the more I think about it with regards to responsibility and freedom and the different kinds of source compatibilists there are, I am really trying to take Tempe's theory of different incompatibilists, the different incompatibilists there are, and adopt that same kind of framework to a compatibilist theory and argue that there's some leeway that needs to be available, some leeway that needs to be there, like dispositional ability, incompatibilism, but also like a hybrid model where you also are the source. I don't think anyone has ever done that in the compatibilist community, at least with regards from a theological perspective.
Hmm.
Um, so I'll give you an example. The hybrid so far on the market of leeway compatibilism and source compatibilism is Nelkin's view, Anna Nelkin. She says that, and this is really tricky, but it's really interesting the more you think about it. The ability to do otherwise is necessary to be blameworthy for something, but it is not necessary to be praiseworthy for something. And when I first heard it, I was like, dude, there's no way. That's so dumb. But dude, the more I'm thinking about it, it's like it's pretty intuitive to me. Like when if you do something praiseworthy, what you don't think is you should have done otherwise. You just say good job.
Yeah.
But when you're blameworthy for something, you're like, you're so dumb. Why didn't you do this instead? And so it's almost like so intuitive to me. And I think it really bridges the gap between incompatibilists and compatibilists. And I kind of want to take that same kind of theory and adopt it to a compatibilist framework for the Christian,
Mm-hmm.
uh, wrap it with transoral deprivation and everything like that, similar to what we've actually talked about here in this with response to Finny and stuff. So I would not be a staunch, hardcore, narrow source compatibilist like Sartario and Sear. I would want to try to argue for a middle ground. Like there's some leeway here, and that's fine. Um, that takes a lot of work because Sartario's book is pretty impressive, to be honest. It's pretty hardcore.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm thinking about something else. Hold that
What do you think,
Bible.
man?
Well, I wanted to mention a little bit about Satan because I always, anytime I think about transworld deprivation, the fascinating unknown is Satan. And I wanted to mention a couple of things that has crossed my mind this last week. Um, and one of them is just talking about the Old Testament passage, like I mentioned earlier in Isaiah 14, that talks about Satan. And I wanted to mention why I think it doesn't actually talk about Satan in Isaiah 14 for sure. And this is from the Net Study Bible version 2. Um, so let me see where this is. So it's like verses 12. Okay. So I guess I could just read the verses first. Let me see if I have the rights. Okay. So it starts in it's chapter 14, verse 12. Look now, you have fallen from the sky, O shining one, son of dawn. You have been cut down to the ground, O conqueror of the nations. You said to yourself, I will climb up to the sky above the stars of El, which is God. I will set up my throne. I will rule on the mountain of the assembly on the remote slopes of Zaphon. I will climb up to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you were brought down to Sheol, to the remote slopes of the pit. Those who stare at you, they look at you carefully, thinking, Is this the man who shook the earth, the one who made the kingdoms tremble? Is this the one who made the world like a wilderness, who ruined its cities and refused to free its prisoners so that they could return home? And all the kings of the nations, all of them, lie down in splendor in each their own tomb. It goes on to say more. But those first couple verses in particular are imagery to what has been historically understood as Satan. So the background of the imagery in this whole section is directed at the king of Babylon, who is clearly depicted as a human ruler. Other kings of the earth address him as such. He is called the man in verse 16 later on, and according to verse 19 and 20, he possesses a physical body. Nevertheless, the language in verse 12 to 15 has led some to see a dual referent in the taunt song. These verses, which appear to be spoken by other pagan kings to this pagan king, contain several titles and motifs that resemble those of Canaanite mythology, including references to Halil, son of Shakar, the stars of El, the mountain of the assembly, the recesses of Zaphon, and the divine title Most High. Apparently, these verses allude to a mythological story about minor gods who tried to take over Zaphon in the mountain of the gods. He attempted a coup and failed. He was hurled down to the underworld. The king of Babylon is taunted for having the similar unrealized delusions of grandeur. Some Christians have seen this as an allusion to the fall of Satan, but here it seems conceptually unwarranted. So this is from a book from J. Martin's Isaiah is the title, page 1061. So, and there's other things saying that this is like a play on words or a parody song for this Canaanite mythology. So they're taking Isaiah is taking like material that was very well known in his age and flipping it on its head and drawing comparisons to the mythology that they would have ascribed to and basically making fun of him for it, which is fine. But all of those titles that we would associate with Satan, they were direct references to Canaanite mythology. That's the problem. So it's not necessarily or clearly to be understood as a reference to Satan. It's clearly to be understood as parody. To me, that's sufficient enough to be like, I don't think this is about Satan. So I don't like, is it for sure? Like, is Satan considered the shining one and the son of dawn? And did he try to rule the mountain of the assembly on the remote slopes of Zaphon? Like, maybe, but it'd be a really crazy coincidence that all of those specific terms were used in Canaanite mythology also. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's hard for me to think that they're both true at the same time. It could be. I just don't find that convincing to consider that to be about Satan. All that to show is, like, again, we have very little information about Satan in especially the Old Testament. Specifically Satan, because even you could, the serpent in the garden is not specifically Satan. The deity that God is talking to in Job, we don't know for sure that that is Satan, although we can say, I think, safely assume. So there's very little to understand the character of him. And there's more for Ezekiel. I don't really want to go through it right now. The Ezekiel 28 text 11 through 9 or 19. So it almost makes me think that any information we can actually glean about Satan, we should take from the New Testament and what Jesus specifically says about him. And one of those, I don't know if this part was before we started the video, but I'll mention it again. Sorry if I'm redundant. But one of the things that is said about Satan in Revelations is that he fell from heaven and took a third of the stars with him. in the prophetic language of Revelations. And when we talk about transworld deprivation, the biggest and most persistent objection we get when we say God can't create moral beings is, well, God created angels and some of them are morally perfect. And my argument back to them is angels are not moral, period. I don't think there's any indication of that in the scriptures at all. Some people are like, well, a third of them follow Satan and are destined to be punished or are being actively punished right now for that. So the fact that God punished some of them means that they must have been morally um, responsible in some sense. But from that text in Revelations, to me, it seems like Satan took those angels and that he forced them in some sense. Like there's compulsion or some type of he is the main leader and they are doomed or tied to follow him now. Like he made them fall from the sky. He knocked them out of the heaven. So it's his fault. So they are doomed to follow their ruler, which for some angels is God, and for some it's Satan. And the ones that are Satan are just kind of screwed. Like there's nothing they can do about it. They're stuck. So again, I feel like they're holy dogs is how I'm gonna keep talking to them. Cause like
Holy dogs.
if you have like a good boy dog, right? Like he's awesome. He's obedient. Like, is that dog moral, or is it just a good
Yeah,
pupper?
because I mean, the interesting thing is angels, I think, are reasons responsive, but so are dogs.
To an extent,
Right. Right. But they're not reasons responsive to moral reasons. And
yes,
that's what moral responsibility requires, at least if guidance control is true. So I don't think that angels could be like they're not morally responsible in the sense that they're not morally responsive. They're not reasons responsive to moral reasons. They're just like they're not agents. They're not moral agents.
yeah,
Let's say that. So
yeah,
they're agents, but they're not moral agents. And I think that's the big difference, which is one reason how we tried to describe, even though I think it's a big deal, you don't think it's a big deal, with regards to our objections to transworld deprivation. To me, that's a really, really big objection. If God can create moral agents perfect, then it doesn't seem like your transworld deprivation is getting off the floor because obviously he did it with angels. Well, if they're not moral agents to begin with, problem solved.
yeah.
Right?
Which is what I hold to. Um, but all that to just I've been racking my brain about like why does Satan exist? Like
Right.
it in the Bible just gives us nothing to go off of. It is assumed he is a foil to Jesus and he exists in little bits and pieces throughout the whole story, but we don't really know much about his motivation. We don't know much about how it happened in the first place. He is an entity that is assumed. And if you want to go back to the very beginning of the Bible, like the earth was without form and void, and darkness was across the face of the abyss, like there is a sense of chaos, darkness, void, desolation, wilderness. Like all of these concepts are present from the start. And you could even take there's a real like logical reason to assume that the translation in Genesis, we can't say for sure one way or another, but it should be translated when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was across the face of the deep.
Right.
So you can, like, by default, from the very start of the beginnings of the universe, there is something like evil is afoot, chaos, like disorder, like something is going on. And I would vouch to say that the history of Satan was definitely pre Genesis. I don't think the creation of angels is explained in the 6 days of creation. I don't see them created there. There's heavenly bodies created, but you could say that's just the solar system. That's not the angels of the hosts of heavens. It does say in the Old Testament that Jesus was present when the host of heavens was created. Um, there's allusions to his presence there, but I don't think that within time that we can place it in the Genesis story sometime between, whether you take young Earth or old Earth, like at some point in those, in that time that God was creating, that the angels were also created there. I think it's pre-Genesis. I think there's a lot going on pre-Genesis that we have no idea about, and I think a lot of it has to do with Satan. And unfortunately, we are not privy to that revelation. And there might be a lot of secrets of his origin locked into the Revelation story, but good luck trying to figure that book out. Like, it is difficult, and I think that that is a book for the tribulation and the end times. Everything in that book is going to become abundantly clear to the 144,000 who will be able to use it as a powerful tool of evangelism. But until that time, I feel like it's locked behind a lot of mystery. And that's just how it's going to be until God enables people to understand it. It's just tough though. But I was listening to Jordan Peterson's series on Exodus. I've been listening to that while I run. And it actually is a lot better than I thought it'd be. So shout out. It's not like his Genesis series where he's just himself talking out of his butt sometimes, but he has a whole panel of Old Testament scholars, Jewish scholars, evangelical scholars, story people who write stories like narratives, a mystic, just a whole host of people that are giving comments on the story. But one of the things he mentioned is it's better to have a world where evil exists as a possibility, but it's not chosen. And that world is a better world to live in than a world where evil cannot exist at all. Because then essentially we're not really living. And it was something along those lines. And I feel like there's some truth to that sentiment, that the existence of evil, but the ability to not choose it is I think that accurately describes reality. Like that, it's like the only way it could be. And it's better that way. You know what I mean? Like when God created
Right.
the earth, knowing full well what would happen, he still called it good. And I think there's significance to that idea. But we always want to like Satan is like the thing that went awry or the thing that went wrong or that wasn't supposed to happen or God got, bamboozled or tricked or
Right.
wasn't able to control him. And I think that his entire existence is you could be to weed out the chaff, to I don't know, like
I
why.
think
It's hard. It's so hard to think
what you're
about.
trying to do is just trying to come up with a theodicy of why God does the things that he does. First, I think if compatibilism is true, it's a metaphysical truth. So that means God knows it before he creates anything. So
Yeah.
it's in his natural knowledge. And if compatibilism is true, and he does want to create, and I do think that out of an outpouring of his love, he will create. It's called the creative mandate. So that means he will create a world full of moral creatures, image bearers. Okay. So if that's the case, then what will the freedom of these creatures be? I think it's compatibilist because, and to me, my argument, Bignon's argument, is if compatibilism is true, then determinism is more than likely true. So God determines the whole world. Okay. So if that's the case, now there's tons of different responses and problems to that, and we've talked a little bit about those before. Maybe we'll talk about them later in the podcast. But that means he creates the world, determines the world for a reason. And part of that reason, to me, it could be like a divine intimacy theodicy, which is basically just a reason for why God creates the world and determines the world that he does for divine intimacy.
Yeah.
And that includes Satan as part of the plan. Maybe not as satisfactory as you would want, but to me, I think that is sufficient.
Yeah. It's just hard because it's not directly talked about. It's assumed. So
Purpose of
to
philosophy.
So to talk to like an atheist about it, I have to just assume the existence of Satan. I can't tell him why he's there or what he's
Right.
necessarily up to directly. It's all conjecture, which is fine to me, but I don't think it'd necessarily be sufficient for atheists, which
Well, then I would just tell the atheist that a lot of what he believes is also conjecture.
I know
I mean,
it goes
it's just
around in circles. But what do you think about the idea that if God did start the creation process at some point in the world's history, I almost want to place it sometime after the dinosaurs went extinct. What do you think about that? Do you care if I think that?
what do you mean?
So when the Earth is being described as without form and void, I think that's the aftermath of the dinosaurs getting wiped out.
That to me is complete conjecture.
Oh, of
Uh,
course. Isn't an interesting dinosaurs are not in the Bible. I'm sorry, they're not there.
right. I don't know. I haven't thought too much about the Genesis story,
I've
but
just read it all, so it's just been on my mind lately.
to me, the dinosaurs would be created with the living creatures on whatever day that is. I can't remember, but be created with the living creatures. And
So
then
you think humans and dinosaurs coexisted?
maybe not. It depends on what you mean by day. So if it's a six literal 24-hour days, then perhaps. But does science necessarily conclude that? Not really.
There's no evidence that
Um,
they lived at the same time.
right. So then I could just say that God create. I mean, I'm more of a old Earth sort of person, so I'm going to lean towards God created the Earth old with old like features, and I don't find that deceptive at all. Although
He
some
wouldn't
people
have
that I know
created the Earth with fossils, though.
could have.
That would just be
Um,
deceptive in my mind.
I don't see how it's deceptive at all.
What would be the point of it? To create the world with dead things on it that were already buried. Like, can I fault God for it? No. But can I wonder about its why? Like, of course. Like,
Purpose?
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know why God would do that, but it doesn't follow that He didn't. Um,
But
obviously.
what I'm saying makes more sense than what you're saying. I I think God could have easily created the world after the time of the dinosaurs, and that dinosaurs aren't even talked about
Depends on what you mean
whatsoever.
by in the beginning. So if in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, that's absolutely like the very first instance of the earth being created. And then the next verse, what what's next?
The
And the
earth
earth
was
was out.
without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the abyss, and the Spirit of God hovered
Maybe.
across the face of the waters. Because if you think about it, that would describe a post extinction event and the warming up of because there is an ice age after, and this would be describing when the Earth was basically a giant ocean, which would place this at like, oh gosh, I don't remember the name of it, but basically the age of the reptiles and the mammals. It'd be right there. So there would be fish, there would be
Problem
birds,
is,
there would be mammals, and there would be reptiles, which are the four.
specifically says He creates fish and birds and everything on a different day.
Yeah, no,
So
the fish and the birds would have existed beforehand, and then from the fish we get reptiles, and from reptiles we would get mammals. If you want to talk about evolution,
depends
but even
on
in
it depends
in
on
the in
interpretation.
the in the historical record, it goes fish, bird, reptile, mammal. And if you want to follow the days of creation, it's similar. So I'm saying, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like, you know, a day, a 24-hour cycle. It could be that. It could be a long time through some type of divinely guided evolution, if you want to use
Right.
that. It doesn't really matter to me, but it's an interesting concept to think of the earth as being created at a point in time and fitting it into a point in history that is not necessarily the very, very, very start. I find that idea a little bit attractive. And even more so, I don't think Adam and Eve were the first humans necessarily. I cannot be sure of that in the text because we get a separate creation account, and you can easily conceptualize that as God creating another form of human in the specific Garden of Eden with specifically different kinds of animals that they were supposed to. That's when you get into livestock and domesticated animals, which I don't think maybe even existed. So all that to say is that the second creation account could account for the creation of humans that were capable of language, that understood relationships and the importance of family, that understood farming, that understood the domestication of animals and the ability to cultivate and subdue. It's a different kind of human that is made in the image of God. And you could venture to say that there's lots of different types of humans around, like Neanderthals and the other types of homos that weren't sapiens. But Homo sapien, the first Homo sapien, could have been Adam and Eve. And God specifically created them with the ability for self-consciousness and all of this stuff that goes along with the knowledge of good and evil. So, and that totally eliminates the need for like Cain to have a wife or marry his sister, like, which has been the general idea. But if there was other humans around, he would have just went
Right.
and found himself another proto-human to be with. And I think that there's a lot of nations and people groups like the Nephilia or however you say it, that could have been a type of proto-human that were very large in scale. That's not a Homo sapien. So I just think it's interesting because I feel like that story isn't as rigid and like point by point needs to be understood the way that it has been understood throughout church history. And I find it interesting to at least entertain the idea, and I don't hold it, hard one way or another. But I find it to be a beautiful story that God specifically created these types of humans with more ability, with consciousness, with something different about them that set them
Right.
apart from the rest. And then obviously they got mixed into all of the, lifestyle and warfare and rape and pillaging that everyone else was doing. So they kind of devolved back into animalistic intentions, and, every thought they had was evil. So they kind of lost what made them particularly human or in the image of God. And that's why, the flood had to happen, which also it's very hard for me to think that the flood was a worldwide event because there's Nephophilia before and after the flood specifically mentioned, but the account also says that it killed every life form that was on the face of the earth outside Noah's family. But there's people that existed before and after the flood that weren't part of Noah's family and are specifically named.
Right.
So
This
regional.
is why this is why I don't get in the biblical data.
Well, I find it fascinating, but it I mean, it's a
I don't think it
story.
matters either way.
I don't
Like
think it
if you
matters either.
me, if I was like, if I found out that like if I found that to be true, I'd be like, oh, that's kind of cool, I guess. Adam and Eve were not the first humans, or it doesn't really matter because when we're doing philosophy and theology about Adam and Eve, it's all theoretical,
Yeah.
and it's well, for the most part, um, it could be totally two different names and totally two different people, and it doesn't even matter. But
Yeah,
um,
conceptually it's all the same.
I have to go.
Yeah,
If we
I'm
want to
good.
wrap up,
I'm good if you're good, bro. We had some interesting one-off concepts and topics and got to the main beef of what we wanted to get to. So
good.
hopefully we'll be able to find something to talk about and do another recording in a couple weeks, depending on
Okay.
Colton's busyness. But we had time for this one during the school season, so maybe that'll be a good showing that we can do more of these, which would be nice. Any last words? Any code
Nope.
words?
Socrates is the code word.
All right, sounds good. See you guys. Thanks for listening.